It's the middle of winter in the Okanagan Valley. Life has slowed down, almost stopped. Migrating birds are all but gone. The vegetation and animals that have stayed behind are either hibernating or gone to ground. Even people have disappeared from the landscape. Still, life goes on. This, in fact, is the start of the water year. The Okanagan Basin is defined by waters that flow from Lake Okanagan down through a ribbon of lakes connected by the Okanagan River, which empties itself at the border between Canada and the United States into the Osoyoos Lake. From there, now in Washington State, the river changes its name to Okanogan River and continues further to the Columbia River, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean. The annual work of water management starts at this time in the midwinter as the snow piles high up in the mountains and surrounding hills. It is here that data is collected that will give the water managers the necessary information needed to make plans for the managing of the water during the year ahead. Water management is critical for the sustainability of water and water usage. Here in the valley, the combined efforts of water experts and managers have been quietly taking place for decades. It is a classic example of traditional knowledge, science, engineering, and international cooperation. But it wasn't always like that.
Before the International Joint Commission got involved, there was some fairly significant issues with flooding and management of the dam just on the American side of Osoyoos Lake. Also in drier years, there was some concern among the irrigation districts, both on the Canadian side and on the American side, that the water would be shared equitably. Both countries were growing. Both countries needed water to support their communities, and the U.S. and Canada are the two best neighbors of any countries in the world, and they wanted to be sure that they had a good way to resolve conflicts as they arose and to come to some kind of consensus agreement about them.
The International Joint Commission was established by treaty in 1909. And it covers a 5,700 mile undefended boundary between the United States and Canada. I think it's been extremely successful. In my professional capacity, I am well aware of transboundary waters in other parts of the world, and the Okanagan Basin is an example of how effective it can work.
So the Boundary Waters Treaty that was passed in 1909 is a great agreement, a very progressive agreement, in that it takes this big elephant of the United States and matches it equally with Canada. So we work together as partners. There's 3 U.S. commissioners appointed by the President, 3 Canadian commissioners by the Prime Minister, and we work by consensus. We're science-based. We don't represent our governments, but we provide guidance and assistance to governments to help them resolve issues between the U.S. and Canada.
Historically, fisheries and water managers were in an adversarial relationship where water managers placed the highest priority on meeting human system needs. they had less information and less skill at meeting natural system and fish needs.
Water management in the past, from our perspective, hasn't been the greatest. Communication was an issue, trust was an issue, and it's taken quite a while to build up that trust and that respect for the people that are involved in water management, and trying to understand, the other party's perspective and where they're coming from in water management.
In the Okanagan River Basin, we are very, very fortunate that we have a collaborative environment that allows us to communicate with one another across the border, as well as amongst the various factions that utilize water, and be able to come up with a balance.
I think the IJC and the Osoyoos Lake Board of Control are an integral part of being able to manage water for Osoyoos Lake and even through to the Okanagan Valley. I mean, the stakeholder groups in terms of fisheries, irrigators, and people living along the lake, I think really rely on the kind of decisions that they make, and they think they represent them admirably both in Canada and the United States.
We have an increase in fish flows. We have a balance of flows in the river. We have elevations maintained in Osoyoos Lake.
We've moved Okanagan sockeye, for example, from a decadal average of only roughly 50,000 fish to the most recent decadal average of over 250,000 fish. So that's a success story in anyone's book.
I guess I'm just really proud of the fact that I'm part of the system, and I'm proud of the way that it works. The communication levels across the border are incredible, and I hope to continue that level of communication service to our users.
What happens in the winter in the mountains surrounding the valley has impacts on how the lakes and rivers will be managed in the spring and summer. Those that rely on water are paying attention.
My name is Tony Littke. I work for the British Columbia Ministry of Environment. I am the Snow Survey Program Coordinator, and this is my 4th winter doing this job. The snowpack in the hills is basically the equivalent of Mother Nature's dam. Snow in the hills is water in the mountains. Heavy snowpack years, there's a lot more water that's going to come down in the spring, a lot more stored over the winter, so obviously that affects the hydrological cycle and anything that occurs downstream. What we're here to do is take into account and survey how much snow there is so that the water supply forecasters downstream can manage all the water use issues that occur from the runoff created by the snowpacks up here in the mountains. Okay, here we're at a automated snow weather station, and what we do here is we measure 4 variables. We measure precipitation, snow water equivalent, snow depth, and temperature. And then for manual snow measurements, there's pipes, and the pipes are specifically calibrated with a certain diameter in the middle. They get inserted in the snow. They take a core sample of a known depth. That sample is then weighed, and then the weight relays to how much water is contained in those pipes, and that gives us our snow water equivalent.
We'll take snow measurements that are taken across the watershed and do analysis on it, statistical analysis relating stream flow that we've observed in historic years relative to snowpacks that we observed in those years. And from that we can make predictions of how much water we expect to see through the spring and into the summer.
Factors such as how much snow is in the mountains, how much water is in that snow, and precipitation in determining how much water that we're going to release through the dams. And what we're trying to achieve are certain target levels ultimately on Okanagan Lake, as well as we're trying to work within seasonal ranges of water flows in the Okanagan River.
We need to say, is there sufficient water to mitigate any floods that might occur if you have a high snowpack and are expecting a very large runoff? If you're expecting a low snowpack, can you capture enough water to carry you through the summer seasons? And how can we get the right levels at the various points in the system, both in terms of lake levels and flows, to meet the different objectives? Where we're sitting by the Okanagan River today is part of the Okanagan Lake regulation system. The structure behind me is the dam that controls Basso Lake. But in addition to this dam, there's dams on Okanagan Lake, which is the primary control point, Skaha Lake, and then there's a section of about 43 kilometers of channelized river as well, along with the works associated with that, drop structures, diversion works. And so that system is involved in controlling the water levels up and down the Okanagan here in Canada.
In some ways, you could say it was unfortunate that we have so many dams and control structures on the system. But another way, because it's generally a semi-arid environment, it's been really important and valuable to have so many different ways of managing the water, of controlling the water, of letting it out slowly and being able to share it between these different demands, which wouldn't otherwise be possible if we didn't have those control structures.
The Osoyoos Dam on Osoyoos Lake is operated under the direction of the Department of Ecology of Washington State, along with the Orville-Tonasket Irrigation District. And so in order for them to make their decisions, they need to know what we're thinking in Canada. We need to have that communication going back and forth. And in the spring, especially when flows are changing more rapidly, we let them know what's going on. It helps them do a better job, and it helps us make sure that we don't cause an adverse impact on the U.S. interests.
Communications are key to the success of the watershed that we're looking at.
Most of the communication between my office and the operators of Zozo Dam takes place during those periods when we make changes in the river flows more frequently.
It's a choreography of sorts. We try to mirror the volume of water that they're discharging downstream to the United States, with the thought in mind that we're also staying within the guidelines and the rules set forth by the International Joint Commission. Communication is of the utmost importance. The Zozo Dam was built in 1986, 1987. It was a joint effort between the United States and Canada. A Canadian firm did the engineering. A U.S. firm actually did the construction of the dam. Mechanically, there's 4 gates at Zozo Dam that can be opened independently to accommodate the flows needed to maintain the water levels in Lake Osoyoos. And there is an overflow weir. The Okanagan River and Lake Osoyoos are the primary water source for Orville-Tonasket Irrigation District that serves a little over 10,000 acres of family farms and residential areas.
There's 2 times, the spring and the fall, that are very challenging for the agricultural community. In the spring, the tree fruits, they primarily want the early water so that they can deal with the possibility of frost. They don't want frost during blossom time. And in the fall, the vineyards want to get that last irrigation in to create an impervious layer between the frost and the roots of the grape plants.
At the same time, the late summer is when the salmon are coming up the river. So you have a competing demand between the irrigators and the fish who need to have water in the stream. So it all has to be very carefully, tightly managed.
The most challenging time of the year for fisheries, like many other interests, really depends on the nature of the year you have. If you have a very wet year, the biggest concern from a fisheries perspective is often trying to make too much space for flood control by sending too much water down the system, which then causes scouring of the eggs or desiccation or drying out of the eggs around Okanagan Lake.
The fish are used to being in the gravels certain times of year. They can't get out of the way. If we bring the spring freshet on those reds before they're ready, we can scour out all the eggs and we lose all those fish.
We have to make decisions well in advance of knowing what the weather's going to bring. So some years you look at it, you can have fairly good confidence in your forecast. Other years you turn out directly wrong, but you have to make your choices months before those play out. And that's probably the biggest overall challenge. In addition to that, we are working with a suite of often competing objectives. Objectives around the fish in Okanagan Lake versus the fish in Okanagan River. Objectives around flooding around the main stem lakes as well as flooding along the river.
Managing water in the summer comes with its own set of demands and concerns.
Our biggest economic drivers in this town are tourism and agriculture. So we absolutely need to manage the water efficiently, carefully, so that we can deal with both of those issues.
You see people out fishing on the river. You see people boating on all the lake. Boating is a major attraction for people around that lake, but also fisheries are a very important interest around that lake. So they are equally important along with the flood control and the irrigation that are much more top of mind for most people.
The Okanagan Lake is the reservoir for the water we consume to water our trees. Without that water, we would not have any fruit trees in this valley or any grapevines in this valley. Water for me in my type of business and for humanity, it's without water we have absolutely nothing. That's what water means for me.
The issue of how to meet all the competing needs is a major challenge, and it's going to be a major challenge. And I think everybody here wants to have clean water, they want to have a great fishery, but they also want to have water for uses, for orchards, for the winery, for on our side of the boundary, for irrigation.
The biggest demands happen in the summer when people are irrigating. There's a tremendous amount of irrigation that happens in the Okanagan system, whether you're talking about the Canadian Okanagan Valley that we have here or farther south going down to Wenatchee. Tremendous amount of fruit growing, grape growing, all very productive area if you irrigate it.
People love water. They always have and they always will. They're drawn to water and they want to live by the water. They want to recreate in the water. They want to do everything in the water. And unfortunately, water is always a finite resource. And unfortunately, when it comes to competition between people and fish, the fish usually lose. Water management becomes a balance for fish. You have to have enough water for them to sustain their livelihood and do the things they need to do in that habitat. But at the same time, you don't want so much water that you cause them problems on the upper end of the extreme. And so water is always a balancing act when it comes to fish species. And they don't need every drop, but they need enough to survive. And that sometimes isn't the easiest balance to strike.
Water means life, but it's not always that simple. In a land defined by moving waters, lakes can pose unusual challenges to both humans and aquatic species, especially the fish. As summer goes along, the temperature of the surface layer of the water in the lake heats up, and with time that layer gets thicker. The fish need cool water and don't want to go into the warm layer. At the same time, rising from the bottom, there is a layer of water that's lacking in oxygen. The fish cannot survive in this water either. These conditions of the warm water level dropping down and the lack of oxygen rising up result in a very narrow band of habitat for the fish to survive in.
And eventually what happens is the fish get squeezed tighter and tighter into a more narrow band of habitat within the lake so that there is no habitat available for them in the summer. So we can have losses either in the adults before they move up to spawn, or we can have losses in the juveniles before they've finished that season in the lake and move out the next spring. So temperature oxygen is a big issue in Osoyoos Lake.
What we've found by experimenting here is that we can actually help reduce that stress on the fish by the management of the water. And that's what we've been working on over the last 10, 15 years to try to find a better way to manage our late summer releases, to try and open that narrowing band up a bit wider so that there's more room for the fish to successfully survive in the lake and find a way to continue their life cycle.
I think the challenge that water management faces for the province in the Okanagan really is trying to meet all of the needs of the water users with having a fairly scarce resource. It's certainly at times of year where it's fairly scarce, and so trying to meet the needs for irrigation and economic development from water and meeting the needs of fisheries and ecology side of things is tough to meet all of those and still balance out the fact that there, at times of year is just not enough water to go around.
The thing that scares me the most is that we might have drought years. If we have no water for agriculture, this valley will not be green. It will be back to a desert. So water is imperative that we have water for farming. There's many things in this valley that are occurring for entertainment, golf courses, and that kind of thing that I think if there's going to be a shortage of water, those businesses should be affected before any other business that supports humanity.
Forest fires are not new to the valley. They have been here long before the first people arrived. But their frequency and intensity are changing.
Climate change is having a major impact on water supplies. With higher evapotranspiration rates, we're seeing more moisture in the atmosphere. And with more moisture in the atmosphere, you're seeing higher intensity storm systems.
And more extreme droughts. They're both related to this basic principle of physics, which is that as air gets warmer, it can hold more water. That means if there's a storm system coming through and it has a whole lot of moisture in it, it can just settle over the valley and rain and cause flooding. If the air that's coming over is dry, it can suck moisture out of the trees, out of the lake. It can cause this incredible evaporative loss. So That's climate change, more floods and more droughts.
We're also seeing changes in ocean currents that affect water supplies on the land. We're also seeing changes in the jet stream. Combined, what we're seeing is storm intensities are far greater when they do occur. We're going to see droughts that last longer. We're going to see changes in the hydrograph where we're going to have less snow, more rainfall, and it's going to come off earlier rather than later.
I've been here with the district for 35 years and I have witnessed some climate change that has drastically increased over the last 5 years. What we're seeing is our spring runoff coming at a much earlier date.
It peaks sooner. We have lower low flows in the fall time. These are all results of changes from climate change.
If we look back to recent winters, we've had exceptionally warm winters to the point where, really outside of what has been observed in the historical record.
We have a grape industry, for example, that has really burgeoned in the last 25 to 30 years. We see sweet cherries being grown in the North Okanagan and at elevations that we have never seen them grown before. So that has been a benefit in terms of extending the limit of production of tender crops. Of course, there's also a downside, and that's with respect to pest species that can also survive.
We built our system of irrigation and water usage based on a certain average and a certain type of climate. Well, that climate is changing now.
So there's issues of how the water comes off the system. There's issues of how much water we get in the system and we store in the system. There's also the temperature aspects of climate change. The Okanagan River Basin is a very warm basin. One of our biggest threats is high summer water temperatures threaten these fish.
As summer gives way to autumn, the demands on the waterway remain high, but the nature of these demands changes.
The history of sockeye salmon in this valley links directly to the Native American people. The Native American people have relied on the salmon and are considered a salmon people.
The Okanagan Indians are a salmon people, and the lake, the river, the valley, that's our life. That's water and salmon. They have everything to do with how we've ever lived and how we are gonna live. It's our spirit, it's our sumich, our power, if you wish. And it's always been part of everything that we do, every decision that we make is reflected in the caring for the thing that cares for us, which is the salmon.
We have a first salmon ceremony where we celebrate the return of the salmon to our area, and that's showing our honor and our respect for that resource so that it continues to come back and provide for our people, for our families.
Historically, the Okanagans have harvested sockeye, chinook, coho, rainbow, steelhead, all from the Okanagan River and from the lakes. And so it's been extremely important, and ever since the 50s when the salmon stocks have declined, it's been pretty traumatic culturally and for subsistence.
It wasn't until the early 90s that people really started putting an effort behind their restoration. So they began an effort which included hatchery programs, habitat restoration actions, water management actions to help restore the sockeye salmon.
The stock has come back and our people are able to go out and fish. They've had an economic fishery, we've had our food fisheries, we've had our ceremonial fisheries.
So the fact that we're here bringing them back, it's pretty important to me because it's you know, it's reconnecting. It's both culturally and for food.
This species of salmon, sockeye salmon, are on the southern end of their range. And so if climate heats up very much, they're going to have a much more difficult time. There are a lot of other threats as well. The adult fish have to come through 8 hydroelectric dams to get up the Columbia River. They're migrating 900 kilometers. That's a lot of distance. There are predators along the way. All of those things are things that can threaten the fish if they're not managed appropriately.
As the seasons move on and the annual cycle repeats, change is creating new challenges for those with responsibility for the waters of the valley.
Probably the greatest challenge facing the Okanagan is climate change. Going forward, climate change will change the hydrology of the region in a way that there will be less snowpack, there will be more winter runoff, fall runoff, and early spring runoff. Agricultural and human systems that are present in the Okanagan Valley are adapted to the historical hydrograph, as are the biological adaptations of the fish. So both of them are going to have to change, and we're going to have to find ways of intervening if we want them both to be sustainable going into the future.
Another major factor that we have to consider is the effect of invasive species, both plant species that can have an impact on waterways, can interfere with the natural vegetation along stream banks, for example. And we're particularly concerned at the moment about the imminent arrival of species such as zebra mussels, which will have a devastating effect on the water supply.
We really need to stop wasting the water and be a lot more conscientious about avoiding pollution. And then we don't want to get into conflicts between all these different user groups, between the fish and the farmers and the urban city dwellers. We want to avoid any conflict that we can have. So the cheapest way, the best form of water that we can have is water that we get from conservation.
There will be challenges ahead that we'll all have to face, but with the right tools and the right attitude and a willingness to work together and communicate, I don't think that there's anything that's insurmountable. Every stock of fish in this river basin is better off today than they were 20 years ago. There aren't many basins in the Columbia River that can say that. And so we're seen as an example of what's possible.
I don't think I can stress enough the need for dialogue amongst the groups who have an interest in water here. And I have to say, although the science is very important, the dialogue is just as important.
We have to get the word out that we're working together. All of us are working together. Not just the Indians, not just First Nations, not just the commission. All of us are doing it.
We need to honor the water, respect the water. I mean, it's one thing for us to communicate, yes, agree that we need to do something about it, but until we start respecting that water and honoring those fish, nothing's going to happen because we haven't done anything. We've just talked about it, and we need action. If we don't watch it and we don't start coming up with plans on how to better protect the habitat that we have left, we're going to lose that habitat.
So yes, I'm gravely concerned about some of the threats that we face, but I also know that we're enormously creative, and so I'm confident that we can find solutions to many of these problems going forward if we apply ourselves.
Mark Twain said that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And in many parts of the world, that's what happened. There are wars in the Middle East and in Asia and in other parts of the world over the control of water resources. And we have a system here that's worked very effectively to avoid that.
Another year has come and gone. Another harvest has been collected. Another season is ending. As the water flows on to make its way to the Pacific, many take time to ponder over the past year and its successes and challenges. And just as the water cycle continues, so does life on the river. Like life itself, the river comes with all its joys and challenges. All humans have a connection with water. It flows through our bodies. We drink it. We bathe in it. We use it for everything we do in life. We are bound by it in more ways than we sometimes realize. That's why we have to protect its health and vitality, so that future generations can enjoy our beautiful blue planet just as we do today.